So, a few days ago, the BBC released this video here. What has the BBC ever done for me? And this is a remake of I'm not sure if it's 1985 or 1986. This is a remake of a John Cleese video, also a BBC TV license advert here. And I think it's very much worth watching both of these videos, partly to learn about the BBC and partly to see how it's changed over the years. The 2026 version, it starts off in the Queen Victoria pub in EastEnders, and then it becomes a bit of a song and dance number. He moves outside the pub, then we get a bit of info about the weather service, regional radio. It's very flashy. They've obviously spent a lot of money on this one here, and they name check as much as they possibly can. And this is a huge contrast. So the 1980s version, it stars John Cleese, and it uses the joke, "What has the BBC ever done for us?" which is obviously from The Life of Brian. What have the Romans ever done for us? And obviously the Romans did quite a bit. But while the 2026 version, it's a big song and dance number. They go from this place to that place to the other ones to bits of animation and so on and so forth. The 1980s version is interesting because, firstly, it never actually leaves the pub. So much less money. Maybe that's a reflection of the time, of the expense as well. But the second way that it's different, and I think is really interesting, is that they never or barely ever mention the actual shows. For example, these two gentlemen here. If you were around in the 1980s, you know who these people are. You don't need me to tell you. I was around in the 1980s. I know who these people are. They are so famous, they were so famous, that you don't even need to mention the show that they were in. And basically, that's all that the 1980s version is. It chops and changes from one table in the pub to another. So this person, for example, extremely famous, doesn't need to be named. That's a huge sign of how far the BBC has fallen. In the 1980s, they could make a licensed TV advert and not mention any of the actual names of the programs that they talk about. In 2026, they mention a lot of specifics. So I'm not going to break down sort of every single frame in the video, but broadly, I thought it went into entertainment, then events, and then public service. Entertainment, honestly, I don't understand why the BBC does entertainment anymore. I don't understand how a public service broadcaster can justify that. The trailer mentions things like EastEnders, Traitors, Doctor Who, Casualty, Wallace and Gromit, nature documentaries, Call the Midwife, Strictly Come Dancing, The Apprentice, and for some reason tries to take credit for making Adele famous, which is very strange. Like, surely Adele would have become famous whether the BBC existed or not. So they talk about a lot of entertainment. I don't think they can really justify doing that. The second strand I identified was events. So raising money for charity. They talked about Glastonbury, Wimbledon, Match of the Day. Again, Glastonbury, Wimbledon, Match of the Day, they would happen whether the BBC existed or not. So in the 1980s, maybe that was justifiable. In 2026, any commercial organisation can show Glastonbury or Wimbledon or Match of the Day. The third strand, and this is where I think the BBC could perhaps justify its existence if it was able to do so. Later in the video, I'm going to talk about how the BBC seems institutionally incapable of self-reflection and of change. But the one area where the BBC could justify its existence is public service. So things that were mentioned in this video were the regional radio, such as Welsh radio, the weather service, kids' educational content like Bite Size, and BBC News. So this is the strand like I say, where the BBC could justify its existence, but is kind of failing to do so. The BBC is having a bit of a funding crisis. So here is The Independent, the 14th of July. Fewer people are paying the unenforceable BBC licence fee. Here's what could replace it. The future of the BBC's TV licence fee is under scrutiny after the number of licences fell by more than 500,000 in a single year. The corporation's annual report, released on Tuesday, showed there were 23.3 million licences active by the end of the last financial year, meaning a drop of 540,000. The number has fallen by more than 2.5 million since the start of the decade, when it stood at 25.9 million. So that's like 10% of people, and they don't care about it enough to pay the fee. A government review of the BBC's Royal Charter is underway, examining its funding model. Culture Secretary Lisa Nandy has already labelled the licence fee unenforceable and insufficient, while the BBC has said it is willing to consider radical options for future funding. Let's have a look at some of the potential options that have been talking about. So right now, the standard TV licence fee is £180 a year, is the main source of funding: television, radio, online, iPlayer, sounds, etc., etc. And basically you need a licence fee if you want to watch live TV. That's not legal advice. Here's options for what could happen instead, because the current model is not working. Advertising. It's been suggested the BBC could move to funding through commercial advertising similar to other television channels. In response to this option, the corporation has previously said this would lead to a different BBC. There are well-founded and long-standing concerns about an advertising model, including the fact it would draw revenue away from other broadcasters, including public service broadcasters. A subscription model similar to that of streaming services such as Netflix or Disney Plus. The BBC has previously said a subscription model would turn a public service into a consumer product and incentivize commissioners to prioritize content which attracts subscribers and reduces subscriber churn. This would result in cutting services that are not commercially focused: education, radio, news, local services. Yeah, and I think local services, news, education, that's kind of the area where the BBC can justify its existence, I think. So I can see definite problems with a subscription model. Taxation. The government has previously said it is not considering general taxation. In January 2025, Ms. Nandy, the Culture Secretary, said this option had been discounted as the government wanted to protect the BBC from political interference. So the BBC is having existential problems. But why? Okay, exhibit number 1, November 2025. BBC apologises to Trump over Panorama edit, but refuses to pay compensation. The BBC has apologised to US President Donald Trump for a Panorama episode that spliced parts of his 6 January 2021 speech together, but rejected his demands for compensation. The corporation said that the edit had given the mistaken impression that President Trump had made a direct call for violent action and said it would not show the 2024 programme again. Lawyers for Trump have threatened to sue the BBC for $1 billion. That's ongoing as far as I know. Culture Secretary Lisa Nandy told BBC Breakfast she was confident the corporation was gripping this with the seriousness it demands. So some moron at BBC News took one part of President Trump's speech, another part of President Trump's speech, an hour apart, and put those two pieces of speech together to look like he said them in one sentence. I mean, this is really stupid. Did they think no one would notice? The Culture Secretary told BBC Radio 4's Today programme the BBC's editorial standards and guidelines were in some cases not robust enough and in other cases not consistently applied. So BBC News has rules but doesn't always apply them, and they misedit the president's speech to make him look like he's calling for violence. Really stupid. This is why people don't like the BBC. Exhibit 1. Exhibit 2, the Jerusalem Post. Yahud should be translated as Jews, not Israelis, experts tell Post in light of BBC inquiry. The BBC stated there were no issues with translating Arab word Yahud as Jews, Israel, or Israeli forces, despite criticism from Arabic Camera earlier in 2025. The BBC's assertion that the Arabic word Yahud can be translated as Israelis or IDF is unequivocally wrong, a spokesman for Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis told the Jerusalem Post following the publication of the BBC's inquiry into whether its controversial documentary breached BBC's editorial guidelines. Colloquial Gazan Arabic has distinct terms for military, soldiers, Israelis and Zionists, none of which is Yahud, a word that unequivocally means Jew or the Jews. Having lived in an Arabic-speaking country, I agree with this. Yahud specifically does mean Jew. On February 17th, the BBC broadcast the programme, which was narrated by this person here, then 13, living in Gaza. Media outlets revealed the father of the boy was a deputy minister in the proscribed organisation government. How could you not reveal that? Why would you not reveal that? I mean, this is why people hate the BBC. Exhibit 2 and 3, I suppose. It said the failure to disclose in the programme the information about the narrator's father's position as Deputy Minister of Agriculture in the proscribed organisation-run government in Gaza was a breach of the BBC's editorial guidelines. This is why people hate the BBC. Next exhibit, we have The Spectator. Why won't the BBC use the word Jews? I was intrigued to learn from the BBC Today programme on Tuesday that buildings across the UK will be illuminated this evening to mark Holocaust Memorial Day, which commemorates the 6 million people murdered by the mid-20th century German regime more than 80 years ago. Who were these unfortunate people, I wondered? Just anyone at all? Was it a wholly indiscriminate spot of slaughter? I have some vague memory it was one race in particular that was singled out for extermination, but the BBC dared not say their name. That's really weird. So yes, 6 million people murdered by the mid-20th century Germans, but who were they? This is why people don't really care about the BBC anymore. But they don't seem to have just a problem with Jews and Israelis. This is Arab News. Never came across this organisation before, to be honest. BBC slammed for mistranslating Arabic interview of released Palestinian prisoner. So this is from 2023. The BBC has come under fire for mistranslating the words of a Palestinian prisoner following her exchange as part of a hostage release deal. Respond Crisis Translation stated that the former detainee criticised her Israeli captors in her initial statement, condemning them for their inhumane treatment of prisoners. They imprisoned us for a month. As winter came, they cut off the electricity. We almost died from the cold weather. Was translated to English subtitles as, and no one helped us. Only proscribed organisation cared. Those who felt our suffering, I thank them very much. This bit here seems to have absolutely nothing to do with this bit here. How could you make that mistake? And then the BBC responds, the shortened video clip we posted did not included English subtitles, but due to an editing error, did not include the full comments themselves. We've since uploaded the original video clip, and so that includes the full comments with corresponding translation. I mean, the Middle East, obviously a very contentious area of the world, and the BBC manages to upset both sides of it, because At best, they're extremely careless about what they do. So I think public service, I think news is the only area where the BBC could justify their existence. But they're completely incompetent at doing news. They're obviously biased and sloppy. For example, this is from Open Democracy, Jimmy Savile and the BBC, the Pollard Report. The BBC commissioned a £2 million investigation into why it failed to broadcast what it knew about Jimmy Savile, possibly the most famous TV personality of late 20th century Britain, and instead transmitted tributes to the serial child botherer after he died. The report identified catastrophic mismanagement, don't know what that is. So December 19th, the BBC released the result of 2 inquiries. The first analysed why BBC Two's flagship current affairs programme, Newsnight, failed last December to broadcast a report alleging bad things with children done by Jimmy Savile, and then misled the public about why the item was abandoned. So Jimmy Savile, BBC employee, news department investigates him, decides not to put the report out. Second inquiry was related. They libelled a former Tory politician, ended up having to pay him a lot of money. Taken together, the 2 documents offer a devastating insight into the BBC's insular culture, its weak management, its dismissive attitude to external criticism, and its chaotic response to the furore that erupted in October 2012. There was suspicion that the Newsnight item on Savile had been suppressed so as to avoid embarrassment over the fact that 4 separate tribute programmes to Savile were due to be broadcast on radio and television over the 2011 Christmas period. In truth, it never seemed plausible. So, okay, that didn't happen, that's fine. However, some mystery still attaches to these discussions. And then it goes into details about all the different meetings and conversations that they had and didn't have. For example, Mr. Mitchell said, as was a common feature of his evidence, that he could remember virtually nothing of this meeting. I found the frequency with which Mr. Mitchell's memory failed him surprising. It's not just Jimmy Savile, there's Rolf Harris, there's Stuart Hall, there's multiple people like this. And it seems like possibly, maybe, when you've got an organisation which has these kinds of employees, like Jimmy Savile, like Rolf Harris, and so on, you spend so much time pushing things down and not dealing with your issues that perhaps that's made the BBC institutionally incapable of actually changing. So back to the video, the 2026, what has the BBC ever done for me? There's a point towards the end where we go into a room and Louis Theroux is stood there saying, you know, none of this has to exist. We could just switch it off. And to be honest, it's very tempting because as much as the BBC has contributed a lot to the UK, it's difficult to see why it should continue. Thanks for watching.